welcome to Tabletop Gaming Guild. Tabletop Gaming Guild is all about the experiences and memories of playing tabletop games with friends and families can create. And today we'll be looking at Apiary, a game designed by Connie Vogelman and published by Stonemaier Games. In Apiary, you play as bees in space! And you're going to be trying to grow your hive and honor your queen. This is a worker placement game, so a turn is going to consist of either placing a worker or retrieving all your workers. When placing a worker, your action is going to be determined by the location in which your worker was placed, as well as the strength of your worker. Let's go through each worker placement section. In the Explore section, you're going to be placing a worker, and that worker's strength determines how far the queen moves. When they move, they get to take the bonus tile, and the rewards for that bonus tile, if there is one in that location, and then flip a new planet. When they flip a new planet, they take whatever resource is shown, and if there is any empty spaces, they get to add a resource of their choice to that space, and they also get that resource. If other workers go in this space, they first bump your worker over, and they would actually total the value of the workers in both spots. So, in this case, the red worker would get to move the queen 3 spaces. Then in future turns, if another worker is ever placed, and there are not enough spaces on the board for that worker placement spot, the first one to have been placed is bumped and returned to the owner. We'll go over what happens when a worker is bumped later. If anybody ever uses a strength 4 worker in this worker placement spot, they would not only get to use the movement per normal, if they end their turn in a space that has a power, they can take that as well. So in this case, if the blue worker had ended their turn there, they would not only get the 2 fiber, they would also get to take the 4 power, in which case they get 2 resources of their choice and 3 points. Now technically this is an illegal action because a queen can never end their movement where they started, but for sake of the example, that's what we're going with. Let's move on to the advance action, which differs slightly in a 2 to 3 player game from the 4 to 5. In a 2 to 3 player game, you're only going to have one set of actions to go for all 3 tile types. But in a 4 to 5, you have 2 sets. If you were to take the farm action, you would look at the value of your worker plus the spot below. In this case, if it's empty, it's still a +1. And that would determine which column you can buy from. I would only get to pick from the first column because I need a value of 2+. I then would pay the cost at the bottom, in this case a fiber and a water, and put that in my hive, taking any bonuses shown on the hive tile that is covered. And the recruit and development work in the same way. The farm tiles give you resources you can harvest anytime you recall workers. The recruit tiles give you additional abilities that trigger anytime you take specific actions listed on the tile. And the development tiles are instant effects. On top of that, if you ever use a 4 power worker to go into one of these spaces, you get 3 points. Next, let's move on to the convert section. When you take a convert action, you can do any of these transactions a number of times equal to the power of your worker. If you were to have used a 4 power worker in this spot before taking any actions, you would get to teach a dance. In which case you would take the stack of tiles, pick a dance you want to teach, and select the number of tiles required with one of these tiles. In this case, anytime somebody did this dance, they would spend 1 point to get a card. And for having taught the dance, I would put my cube there to indicate anytime anybody other than me does the dance, I get a queen's favor. Now that I've taught the dance, I could use my 4 actions to run the dance or do any of these conversions up to 4 times. The next section can only be done with a 4 power worker. If you place a 4 power worker here, you get to take one of these carved tiles. They always cost honey, which is hard to get, but they give you goals for the end of the game, such as having 12 points if you have never planted a seed, or 4 points per planted seed. And there's a lot of these tiles, so they change significantly from game to game. The next section is grow. When you place a worker here, you get to take actions equal to the strength of your worker. But before that, if you have used a 4, you get to upgrade your faction by flipping your faction tile. These usually strengthen abilities or give you stronger endgame scoring. When you spend your actions here, you can use one of your actions to spend a pollen to get a worker from your reserve. Usually you start the game with one worker in reserve, but anytime you hibernate, those go into the reserve. And I'll talk about hibernation later. If you use 2 strength and 2 resources, you can gain one of these frames to expand your hive. The final section is research. When you place a worker here, you get to take cards equal to the number of your worker. And from those cards, you can pick one and discard the rest. On top of that, if you used a 4 power worker, you get to tuck that card or a card previously acquired under your player mat for endgame scoring. At the beginning of the game, you can only tuck 2 cards, but there's 2 additional spots that can be unlocked each time you play a frame. However, you should also note these are multi-function cards. They can be either used for just any basic resource, the text on the top, or if you plant them, they go for the endgame scoring. Not every card will work well with every strategy, especially the endgame scoring may not work for you, which is why the multifunction is very important, and the ability to trade them in the convert section. So that's all the worker placement sections in Apiary. But before we go into retrieving, let's talk about what happens if a worker is bumped. When that happens, you have one of 2 choices. You can either put it in your reserve to use later when you recall and harvest, or you can put it back in your active pool. When you put it back in your active pool, one of 2 things happen. If it's a level 4 worker, it must go into hibernation, in which case you get to put one of your hibernation tokens in the hibernation comb and take the resource or reward shown in that location. Any number other than 4 can tick up to the next higher number and become available again for worker placement. There's one more thing to talk about before we get to final scoring, and that is what happens when you retrieve your workers. When you do that, you get any workers on the board or in your landing area back to you. If they were currently a level 4, they would immediately hibernate. All other workers would get a chance to harvest from farm tiles, getting the resources shown on top. Each bee can only harvest 1 tile, and they cannot harvest the same tile. And then they would all tick up 1 strength and become available for worker placement again. So let's talk about how the game ends and final scoring. 2 things can trigger the end of the game. Either all the hibernation comb locations are filled, or one player has hibernated 7 times. Once the game ends, you would add certain things to your score so far. First off, you would add the value of any planted seeds. Those are the cards you tucked under your board. You would then look at every tile you've acquired and score the points listed on them. You would then score points for any carved tile acquired, then any points from your Queen's Favorite track. You'd get 8 points for filling your hive, and an additional 8 points for every frame you filled. You would then score any endgame scoring from your faction ability. And finally, you would look at the hibernation comb, and each section is worth points for the majority, and some of them have points for second place majority. After that, whoever has the highest number of points wins the game. So that's how Apiary is played. It's a fairly meaty game that can go a little long. The box says 60 to 90, but I think that is more likely 90 to 120. And I've only played it in 3-player games. I'm not sure how much a 4 or 5 player would increase the length, but you're going to be hibernating a lot quicker with a 4 or 5 player game, so it may not affect the length of the game. For those reasons, this is definitely a mid to heavy game that I would not necessarily introduce to just anybody, but it is amazing. There's so many strategies you can take in this game, and there are so many of these tiles between the farming, recruit, development, and the carved tiles. Adds lots and lots of variability. The card powers are really cool, and And, sometimes they don't work out very well, but sometimes they can be a game changer. The scoring generally tends to be on the higher end. In fact, you can get a ton of points in a single turn. One single tile, if you played well with it, can get you up to like 24 points. That said, in my experience with the game so far, there are a couple of avenues that aren't quite as strong in a 3-player game. Namely, the farming stands out as being slightly weaker in the lower player counts. However, the effectiveness of the farming strategy may be impacted significantly by the player count or the style of players you're playing with. My game group tended to rush the hibernation quite a bit, so it meant farming was definitely weakened. Also, taking into consideration this is not a huge difference. You're really just talking about the difference between scoring first or second place, not necessarily being way behind. You can definitely win using the farming strategy, but it just seems a little bit harder than some of the other avenues. Overall, this game gives you lots of options, and while there is a little bit of player action that could take things you're aiming for, there are so many options. It's easy to redirect and go for another strategy and score possibly even more points than what you had originally planned. So this is definitely in consideration to be one of my top games. I really love this game, and I will play it any chance I get. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to check us out on other social media such as Instagram and Facebook, and don't forget to like and subscribe.